Have you ever wondered how it's possible for a massive 100,000-ton ship to stay afloat in the water? You've probably seen those floating giants at sea and stopped to think, how is it that something so incredibly heavy doesn't sink immediately? It's hard to imagine, right? A ship of that size seems to defy the laws of physics, but the reality is that the physics behind all of this is truly impressive, and the answer to how these giants stay afloat isn't as complicated as it seems at first glance. It all comes down to a fundamental principle, Archimedes' principle. Now, before you start thinking that this is just a matter of common sense, let me explain why Archimedes' principle isn't as simple as it seems at first. When we observe a ship floating in the water, the first thing that comes to mind is that it's in equilibrium with the water, as if the ship is resting on a solid surface that keeps it in place. But the truth is much more complex and fascinating than that. And the reason why it's more complicated than it seems lies in the ship's great weight. If Archimedes' principle weren't so incredibly powerful, that 100,000-ton ship would simply sink into the water like a stone. Imagine the impact if such a heavy object fell directly into the water. The ship, like a solid block of metal, would go straight to the bottom. But that's not what happens. Archimedes' principle tells us that an object that is submerged, either fully or partially, in a fluid, like water, experiences an upward force equal to the weight of the fluid displaced by the object. This principle seems very straightforward, but what really makes a ship of this size work is how this principle is applied on a massive scale. For the ship to stay afloat, it must displace enough water to generate an upward buoyant force equal to the weight of the ship. And that's the key to it all. The ship's weight is enormous, but the volume of water it displaces is just as large. If the ship displaces an amount of water whose weight is greater than its own, it will stay afloat, no matter how massive it is. Sounds simple, right? But it's not. This principle must be harnessed with impressive engineering and a specific design to make it work on a large scale. A 100,000-ton ship isn't just a solid mass of metal. Although its weight is colossal, the ship is designed so that it can efficiently use its shape and volume to optimally displace water. Hey, the parts of the ship that are submerged, like the hull, are designed with a special shape, with curves and larger areas where water can be displaced. As the ship enters the water, the submerged parts begin to push the water to the sides, generating an upward force. This force is known as buoyancy, but the trick is that for the ship to stay afloat, that buoyant force must be exactly equal to the weight of the ship. If the buoyant force is less, the ship will sink. If the buoyant force is greater, the ship will rise out of the water. Here's where the ship's shape comes into play. Ships don't have a spherical or cubic shape like a heavy block of metal. Imagine a block of steel floating in the water. It would be almost impossible for it to stay afloat. Instead, ships have a concave, an elongated shape designed to displace a huge amount of water. This isn't by accident. It's designed this way because the ship needs to distribute its weight as efficiently as possible. If you look at a large tonnage ship from a side profile, you'll notice that the bottom, which is submerged in the water, is much wider and larger than the top. Why? Because the goal is to displace as much water as possible to generate the necessary buoyant force. Now imagine a ship were so heavy that it couldn't displace enough water on its own. What would happen then? In this case, if the ship were too dense, the water wouldn't be able to generate enough buoyant force to keep it afloat. But here's the solution the engineers have come up with. Large tonnage ships have specially designed hulls filled with empty spaces full of air, which reduces the ship's total density. You might remember the density formula from school. Density equals mass divided by volume. If a ship has a very large volume but its design allows for a large amount of air inside, the ship's density becomes much lower than that of water, which makes it easier for the ship to stay afloat. When a ship is extremely large but its volume is efficiently designed, the air inside its hull helps reduce the amount of metal required and makes the ship's total density much lower than that of water, which makes the ship displace more water and therefore generate more buoyant force. The lower the density of an object, the easier it is for the water to generate the buoyant force necessary to keep it afloat. This flotation design, along with the way the ship is built, is what allows it to stay afloat, regardless of its impressive size and weight. This principle also explains why ships aren't solid steel structures, but rather complex containers with structures that maximize buoyancy and distribute weight, so that the buoyant force generated by the water is always able to counterbalance the weight of the ship. The engineering of a 100,000-ton ship is not only based on physical principles but also on a deep understanding of how to manipulate those principles to design structures that defy our expectations and allow us to transport tons of cargo across the ocean efficiently and safely. The case of giant cargo ships and aircraft carriers is another fascinating example of how principles of physics and engineering come together in unexpected ways. These massive ships, including aircraft carriers that can weigh more than 100,000 tons, are marvels of human ingenuity. You may think that such a massive structure must have an equally massive hull, but here's something that might surprise you. Aircraft carriers are not just huge metal structures. They contain airtight compartments within their hulls, which play a crucial role in keeping them afloat. These compartments, filled with air, provide buoyancy, the force that keeps the ship from sinking under its own weight. This is one of the secrets to how such heavy vessels maintain their flotation. Despite their immense weight, these air cavities inside the hull help to displace enough water to create an upward force that counterbalances the ship's own weight. This effect works exactly as it does in smaller boats, but on a much larger scale. These air pockets act as large lifts that allow the ship to push more water away than the total weight of the ship itself. Without these strategically placed air compartments, even the largest ships would not have enough displacement to stay afloat. And here's the paradox you may not have considered before. Even though these ships are overwhelmingly massive, they are designed to move without sinking by means of a complex network of buoyancy and structure. Ships don't float merely because they don't sink. They float because they are meticulously designed to displace more water than their weight represents. This is what allows these giants of the sea to glide over water despite their size. The balance between weight and buoyant force is so carefully calibrated through engineering that if the ship's hull weren't specifically designed to maximize this buoyancy, the ship would sink. Now let's take a moment to imagine something simpler, a block of steel floating in water. If you've ever tried to imagine this, it likely seems almost impossible, right? The heavy metal would immediately sink. But here's the catch. This same principle applies to ships, but with more advanced mathematics and clever design working together. A ship is not simply a massive chunk of steel floating aimlessly on the ocean. Instead, it's an engineering masterpiece that uses shapes, materials, and geometry to distribute its weight evenly in a way that maximizes the effects of Archimedes' principle. Ships are crafted with aerodynamic shapes and well-thought-out designs that help ensure they stay afloat. If you were to look at a large cargo ship or an aircraft carrier from the side, you would notice that the hull is wide and rounded at the bottom and tapers toward the top. This is not just a random choice of shape, it's the result of engineering decisions made to create maximum displacement of water, increasing the buoyant force while efficiently distributing the ship's weight. The result? Even ships that weigh as much as several thousand cars, or even entire skyscrapers, can float on water because they displace enough of it. But here's a curious thing. Why does this principle matter so much for the products we use every day? Let's think about everyday objects that are influenced by the same concept of buoyancy. If you've ever used a coffee thermos or a water bottle, you've probably noticed that these items are light, easy to handle, and often designed with a certain structure that makes them practical and durable. The reason for this is that just like the hull of a ship, these containers are built with air cavities inside them. These air pockets allow the liquid inside to stay fresh without breaking the structure of the container. If you think about it, your thermos or bottle is essentially a smaller version of what happens inside a massive ship's hull, the principle of buoyancy applied on a much smaller scale. This same buoyancy principle is found in a wide range of everyday products we use without thinking about it. Have you ever thought about how bottles, jars, and even aerosol cans work in a similar way? Just like ships, these containers need to balance their weight with the forces around them, and the air inside them helps achieve that balance. So next time you open your water bottle or sip from your coffee thermos, remember that you're interacting with the same physics that keeps massive ships afloat. However, what happens if a ship doesn't follow the rules of buoyancy correctly? That's where the problems start. When a ship is poorly designed or overloaded, it might face conditions where it cannot displace enough water to stay afloat. In extreme conditions, such as violent storms or massive waves, a ship could even be forced to exceed its displacement capacity, leading to a potential disaster. Engineers are deeply aware of this risk, and that's why they pay extra attention to how the ship's hull is designed, how cargo is distributed, and the safety features that need to be in place to prevent a ship from reaching its tipping point. Every detail is scrutinized, from how the ship moves through water to how the weight of the cargo is balanced along the hull. For example, the hull design of a ship must ensure that it can handle a variety of factors, from pressure exerted by the water to the hydrodynamics of the ship moving through different sea conditions. Even the materials used in ship construction are chosen to maximize strength and minimize weight, ensuring that the ship can stay afloat while carrying heavy loads. And the engineering behind the ballast, the extra weight in certain sections of the ship designed to keep it stable, is vital in keeping the ship upright in rough seas. So in summary, keeping a 100,000-ton ship afloat is a true marvel of engineering. It's not just about building a large, strong structure and hoping it stays above the water. It involves designing with precision and science, applying Archimedes' principle to a huge scale, and planning every part of the ship's design to work in perfect harmony. The careful shapes, the careful use of air pockets, and the understanding of buoyancy dynamics allow even the heaviest ships to defy logic and physics, staying afloat when it seems impossible. The amazing thing about all of this is that it's not just a large-scale concept. From the smallest products to the largest ships, we see the application of the same principles of buoyancy and structure that have been perfected over centuries. Whether you're holding a bottle of water or crossing the ocean in a gigantic vessel, the physics behind it all is working to maintain balance and stability between weight and buoyancy. Would you like to dive deeper into the physics behind ships or any other fascinating engineering topic? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more. See you next time.